The fastest way to shatter a veil isn't to tear it. It's to look directly through it and describe what you see out loud. Most people live inside a version of reality that was curated for them. Stories handed down, maps drawn by others, walls painted in colors someone else chose. And for most of their lives, they don't question it. Why would they? The walls have always been there. The colors have always looked normal. But then, something shifts. A door opens that wasn't supposed to open. A frequency tune in that no one told you existed. A pattern emerges from data that was never meant to be cross-referenced. And suddenly, the picture changes. You didn't ask for this. You weren't searching for forbidden territory. You simply paid attention where others were trained to look away. And now that you've seen behind the curtain, there's no going back. The old version of reality still plays on screens around you, but you can see the seams, you can see the scaffolding, and so can they. That's why things feel strange now. Not because you changed, but because you see what was always there. And the people who built the stage are starting to notice that the audience has a witness. There's a quiet kind of power that no system is prepared for. It's not loud. It doesn't march with signs or chant in crowds. It sits in a room, connects dots that were never supposed to be joined, and describes reality with surgical accuracy. That kind of seeing disrupts everything, not through attack, through clarity. This is the story of how you ended up here, how ordinary curiosity became forbidden vision, and why the moment you looked, the world changed forever. The first thing you need to understand is that forbidden visions don't announce themselves. They don't come with warnings or red tape. They arrive disguised as curiosity, as a question asked at the wrong time, as a book opened by accident, as a conversation that went somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. And once you're in, you're in. The door doesn't close behind you, it locks. What makes a vision forbidden isn't its content. It's the fact that you were never supposed to see it. There are layers of reality that are designed to remain invisible, not because they're dangerous to you, but because they're dangerous to the architecture of control. When someone accidentally crosses into that space, the reaction is always the same. Not anger, not debate. Panic. Anger means the system still has the upper hand. Panic means something slipped through the cracks. And once that happens, everything gets strange. People who were warm become cold. Systems that seemed stable start malfunctioning in your presence. Signs you never noticed before suddenly appear everywhere. Coincidences that aren't coincidences start clustering around your life. It's almost like the universe is trying to tell you something. Or maybe it's trying to warn you. But here's what most people never realize. The vision you accidentally accessed isn't new. It existed long before you arrived. What changed is that someone finally looked at it without flinching. Someone finally connected the pieces without waiting for permission. And that act alone sent ripples through structures that depend on people never looking in that direction. That's what triggers the panic. Not the content, the timing, not what you know. That you know it now when you weren't supposed to know it yet. The sequence has been broken, the schedule has been disrupted, and the keepers of silence can feel it in their bones. There's also something almost humorous about it. The very mechanisms designed to keep certain truths hidden are the same mechanisms that fail when someone applies them correctly. It's like finding a glitch in the matrix by following the rules too precisely. Nobody expects the student to find the teacher's blind spots by reading the textbook without skipping a single page. This isn't about arrogance or ego. It's about what happens when someone decides to actually use their mind instead of renting it. When thinking stops being performative and becomes operational. When understanding goes a little too far, a little too deep, and arrives earlier than scheduled. So if things around you suddenly feel tense, if clarity feels unwelcome, if seeing feels more dangerous than being told, relax. You didn't do anything wrong. You just became dangerous by accident. And that's exactly why they need you to feel crazy, to feel alone, to feel like maybe you imagined the whole thing. Because the moment you trust your own perception, the system loses its most powerful weapon, the ability to make you doubt what you know. Number 1. You stopped accepting the official map and started reading the terrain yourself. There was a moment, quiet but decisive, when you stopped trusting the map and started trusting your eyes. The official map said the world was a certain way, flat, predictable, organized by authorities who had your best interests at heart. But the terrain told a different story. Roads that dead-ended for no reason, rivers that curved away from certain destinations, mountains that appeared in places that were supposed to be open plains. You noticed the discrepancy. Most people smooth over the mismatch. They explain away the inconsistencies, blame their own confusion, defer to the map because the map comes from people with credentials. But you didn't. You got off the path and walked the terrain directly, and what you found changed everything. The official map isn't designed to help you navigate reality. It's designed to keep you on approved routes. Every correction it makes is a redirection. Every dead end is a boundary. Every warning label is a fence. The map isn't a guide. It's a leash disguised as a resource. When you realized this, you started navigating by landmarks instead of instructions. You started reading the ground instead of following the signs. You noticed patterns that the map couldn't account for because the map was designed to hide them. Contradictions between what authorities said and what actually happened. Discrepancies between public messaging and private behavior. Gaps between the story told in meetings and the results seen in data. You weren't trying to expose anything. You were just trying to get somewhere real. But your method of navigation did something worse than rebellion. It revealed the map as fiction, and that's terrifying to people who depend on everyone following the route they drew. What made this unsettling wasn't that you challenged authority. It was that you bypassed it. You treated reality like terrain instead of a maze, and in doing so you demonstrated something that no authority can survive, that the map is optional, that the terrain is real, and that some people will always choose to see for themselves. Number 2, you began to hear the frequency beneath the noise. Most people experience life as sound. Words, arguments, debates, opinions, breaking news, notifications, alerts, notifications, opinions, arguments, sound, sound, sound. The volume never stops. The content never settles. Every day brings a new controversy, a fresh outrage, a recycled crisis designed to fill the silence. And most people live inside that noise. They mistake it for information. They mistake it for engagement. They mistake it for reality itself. But noise isn't information. Noise is what happens when someone doesn't want you to hear what's underneath. You discovered the frequency. Not by searching for it, but by getting tired of the noise and going quiet long enough to notice what was always playing beneath it. It's subtle. Most people will tell you it doesn't exist. They'll say you're imagining things, overthinking, reading into things that aren't there. But you know what you heard. The frequency is the signal beneath the noise. It's the pattern that persists across all the chaos. It's the consistent logic that governs behavior, decisions, systems, and outcomes, regardless of what story is being told on the surface. And once you heard it clearly, you couldn't unhear it. It plays in everything now, in boardrooms and living rooms, in policy announcements and family dinners, in the news cycle and the algorithm. It's always there, always consistent, always humming beneath the performance. The keepers of silence built their power on the assumption that no one would ever go quiet long enough to hear it. They rely on noise to drown out signal. They flood the environment with content so you'll never have the silence required to listen beneath it. But you did. You stepped out of the noise, even briefly, and you heard what they never wanted anyone to hear. That's why they panic. Not because you discovered something new, because you discovered something old. Something they thought they'd buried so deep beneath the noise that no one would ever find it. But you went quiet, and it was waiting for you there all along. And now that you've heard it, you can't unhear it, and neither can they. Number 3. You connected the timeline fragments no one was supposed to piece together. Most people experience time as a series of events. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. Each moment is isolated. Each event has its own explanation. Each story stands alone. The timeline is clean, linear, and manageable. That's how it's presented, that's how it's taught, that's how it's remembered. But you started noticing something strange. Events that were supposed to be unrelated were connected. Crises that were supposed to be coincidences had timing that was too precise. Patterns that were supposed to be random had architecture. And when you started connecting the fragments across longer stretches of time, the picture that emerged was nothing like the official story. You saw sequences, cause and effect chains that crossed decades, policies that seeded outcomes that wouldn't appear for generations, moves that were made in one era whose consequences were designed to unfold in another. The timeline isn't linear, it's layered. And certain people have always known how to play across those layers, while everyone else is forced to play one move at a time. That's what makes timeline literacy forbidden. It reveals that the present isn't an accident, it's a chess position. And some people have been setting up pieces for longer than anyone alive has been paying attention. When you started connecting fragments across those layers, you began to see moves that hadn't happened yet. You started recognizing patterns that were already in motion long before the public was allowed to notice them. The keepers of silence panic when someone maps the timeline because their entire operation depends on each generation being isolated, each era having its own story, each crisis appearing fresh and unprecedented. But when someone connects the fragments, when someone traces the continuity across decades, the magic trick gets exposed. The rabbit wasn't pulled from the hat. The hat was designed to produce rabbits at specific moments for specific effects. And now you can see the mechanism. That's not just uncomfortable. It's an extinction-level event for anyone whose power depends on you not seeing how long they've been playing. Number 4. You started reading the silences instead of the words. Most people communicate with words. They listen to speeches, read statements, analyze arguments, and form opinions based on what's being said. That's the training. That's what schools reward. That's what social systems reinforce. Focus on content, analyze the argument, evaluate the message. But you discovered that content is the distraction. The real information lives in what's not being said, the pauses that are too long, the topics that are never raised, the questions that get deflected, the patterns that everyone avoids naming out loud. Silence isn't absence, it's language. A language spoken fluently by everyone in power and understood by almost no one on the outside. You learned to read silence the way others read headlines. You started noticing that the most important decisions were always announced in the smallest font, that the most consequential actions came with the least explanation, that the things that mattered most were always handled in rooms where cameras weren't allowed and transcripts weren't made. The silence was the signal. The words were the noise. When you began interpreting silence fluently, you started seeing operations that were invisible to everyone around you. You could read the room before anyone spoke. You could anticipate moves 3 steps before they were announced. You could recognize when a statement was a cover for a decision that had already been made in the silence that preceded it. That ability is what makes you dangerous. Not because you know more facts, because you read context that others are trained to ignore. The keepers of silence built their entire system on the assumption that everyone would keep listening to words and never learn to hear the silence. Every time they told you to focus on what was being said, they were pointing you away from where the real information lived. And now you've learned to hear what they were hiding in plain sight. That's why the panic is so quiet. They can't punish you for reading silence. There's no law against noticing what's not there. But once you've learned to read it, you can see them operating in real time, and they know it. Number 5. You recognize the architecture behind the chaos. Most people experience life as chaos. Random events, unpredictable outcomes, systems that seem broken or inefficient or corrupt. They complain about the chaos. They blame leaders, institutions, human nature. They accept chaos as the natural state of things, messy, uncontrollable, random. But chaos is architecture. What looks like disorder is actually design. The chaos isn't a failure of the system. It's the system working exactly as intended. Certain outcomes are impossible because of how the chaos is structured. Certain paths are always blocked. Certain destinations are always out of reach. Not because of a wall, but because of a current that pushes everyone away from certain possibilities without anyone having to explicitly prohibit them. You saw the architecture. Not the visible structures of buildings and institutions, but the invisible geometry that shapes behavior, controls outcomes, and maintains order beneath the appearance of disorder. It's elegant, it's ancient, and it's been refined over centuries by people who understood that control works best when it feels like freedom. When you recognized the architecture, you started seeing leverage points, places where the system is weakest, currents that can be ridden instead of fought, pressures that can be redirected. You started moving through the architecture instead of against it, not fighting chaos, but flowing through its design with precision. And that made you unpredictable, because you weren't behaving according to the patterns the architecture expected. You were reading it, adapting to it, and using it. The keepers of silence built chaos to be invisible. They counted on people seeing noise and missing the structure beneath. But architecture always has blueprints. And once you learned to read them, the chaos stopped being random. It became a map. And you were the only one who could read it. Number 6. You stopped trusting consensus and started trusting pattern. Most people determine what's real by how many people believe it. If everyone agrees it must be true, that's the logic. That's the training. That's the social contract. Truth is determined by vote, by cultural consensus, by what feels normal after enough repetition. You discovered that consensus is manufactured. It's not the voice of the people, it's the voice of the infrastructure. Algorithms that amplify certain signals and silence others. Systems that reward certain beliefs and punish others. Institutions that define normal so precisely that abnormal becomes unthinkable. Consensus isn't emerging from the population, it's being poured into it. When you stopped trusting consensus, you started trusting pattern. Pattern is indifferent to voting. Pattern doesn't care about feelings or traditions or authority. Pattern simply is. The same cause produces the same effect every time, regardless of who believes it. That's the only ground that isn't shifting beneath your feet. You started mapping pattern across domains. You noticed that the same dynamics that played out in ancient politics were playing out in modern corporations. That the same psychological mechanisms that govern family dysfunction were governing national policy. That the same economic principles that have always enriched a small class were being rebranded every generation as something new. Pattern recognition across time and domain. That's what made you dangerous. Consensus can be manipulated by anyone with enough infrastructure. Pattern cannot. Pattern doesn't negotiate. Pattern doesn't compromise. Pattern just operates. And once you learned to see it, you could predict things that consensus said were impossible. You could see through the manufactured normal. You could recognize the recycling of old patterns in new costumes, and that made consensus feel like a prison you were the only one who could see the bars of. The keepers of silence depend on consensus. They shape it, amplify it, weaponize it. But they can't manufacture pattern. Pattern exists whether they believe in it or not. And when you started reading pattern instead of following consensus, you stepped outside their control, without ever stepping outside the rules. You just started obeying a different authority, the authority of reality. Number 7. You accessed dimensions of knowledge that were gate-kept by role. Most knowledge isn't hidden in vaults, it's hidden in roles. Certain information flows through certain professions, certain circles, certain hierarchies. The knowledge itself isn't secret. It's just routed through channels that require credentials to access. You can't know this unless you are this. You can't understand this unless you've been approved to understand this. That's the gate. Not a wall, a role, a position, a title that grants access to understanding that everyone else is supposed to remain without. And most people accept this. They defer to expertise. They trust that if they need to know something, someone with the right credentials will tell them. They never question the architecture of the gate itself. You started accessing knowledge across roles. You read the books that engineers read. You studied the data that economists analyzed. You followed the patterns that historians documented. Not to become an expert in any of those fields, but to see the intersections, the places where different disciplines described the same phenomenon using different vocabularies. The places where expertise met expertise and revealed something that no single field could see alone. Cross-role literacy is forbidden because it collapses the hierarchy of expertise. The system depends on everyone staying inside their lane, each discipline policing its own boundaries, each expert defending their own domain. But when someone moves freely across domains, when someone can read economics like anthropology and anthropology like physics, the walls start to crack. Not because the person is attacking, Because the person can see what no single expert can see. That's what the keepers of silence can't allow. Not individual knowledge. Cross-pollination. The synthesis that emerges when you let ideas from different territories talk to each other without a gatekeeper in the room. That synthesis produces understanding that no role was designed to contain, and once you had it, you couldn't give it back. You saw too much. You connected too many dots that were never supposed to touch. Number 8. You realized that invisibility is a design, not an accident. Most people believe that what gets attention gets power, that viral moments are moments of influence, that visibility is the goal. But you discovered something counterintuitive. The most powerful forces in any system are the ones that remain invisible. Not because they're hidden, but because they're foundational. You can't point to them directly because everything else is built on top of them. Gravity doesn't announce itself, neither does language, neither does the logic that structures markets, the assumptions that shape policy, the frameworks that organize perception. These things are invisible by design, not by omission, by architecture. The moment something becomes visible, it becomes negotiable. The moment it becomes negotiable, it becomes contestable. So the most powerful forces make themselves invisible by becoming too fundamental to notice. You started seeing the invisible, the structures that everything else rested on, the assumptions that everyone shared without ever articulating, the logic that everyone followed without ever questioning because it was always already there, too close to see. And when you saw it clearly, you saw how it could be changed, not by attacking what's visible, by adjusting what's foundational. That's forbidden vision, not seeing something that doesn't exist, seeing what's always existed but was designed to be invisible, the architecture of invisibility itself. Once you can see it, you can see how it works. Once you can see how it works, you can see how it fails. And once you see that, the whole visible layer above it starts to look different. Fragile, artificial, built on sand that was never as solid as everyone believed. The keepers of silence work very hard to keep the invisible invisible, not because the invisible is dangerous, because visibility is dangerous. When something moves from invisible to visible, it moves from untouchable to negotiable, and negotiable is the one thing they cannot afford. Number 9. You learn to see systems, not situations. Most people experience life as a series of situations. This happened, then this, then this. Each moment is separate. Each crisis is unique. Each outcome is circumstantial. They respond to situations as they arise, treating each one as an isolated event with its own causes and its own solutions. You started seeing systems, the invisible architecture that produces situations predictably, repeatedly, across time. The same patterns that generated this crisis also generated that one. The same logic that produced this outcome also produced that one. When you saw the system, the situations stopped being surprising. They became predictable, and predictability is power. Seeing systems instead of situations is dangerous because it makes you immune to the manipulations that work on people who only see the surface. The outrage machine can't control you because you've seen the system that produces the outrages on schedule. The crisis response can't surprise you because you've mapped the sequence that generates the crises. You're not reacting to the show, you're reading the script. And once you can read the script, you can see the writers. You can see who's creating the situations, why they're timing them this way, what outcomes they're engineering. That's when the vision becomes truly forbidden. Not just seeing the system, seeing the hands that built and maintain it, seeing their incentives, their methods, their vulnerabilities, seeing the game behind the game. The keepers of silence can manage situations. They have protocols for that, procedures for containing crises, scripts for managing narratives, playbooks for handling exposure. But they can't manage someone who sees the system, because the system includes the protocols, the system includes the playbooks. And once you're reading the system, their own tools become inputs to your analysis. Number 10. You understood that silence is not empty, it's strategic. Most people interpret silence as absence. Nothing being said means nothing being decided. The empty room means the meeting was unimportant. The quiet response means the matter is settled. Silence to most ears reads as nothing. You learn to hear silence as operation. Silence is where decisions are made before they're announced. Silence is where power signals its preferences without making itself accountable. Silence is the gap between what is said publicly and what is agreed privately. And when you started reading silence as signal, the public record became a secondary text. The real transcript was always in what wasn't said. That's what makes strategic silence forbidden. It exposes the gap between the theater and the engine room. It reveals that the visible decisions are almost always after-the-fact announcements of conclusions that were already reached in rooms without minutes. And once you can read that gap, you can see exactly where power is actually located versus where it claims to be. The keepers of silence work very hard to make silence seem like nothing. They want you to believe that empty rooms are unimportant, that quiet periods are dead zones, that absence of statement means absence of decision. But you've learned to read the silence, and in the silence you've found the real architecture, the decisions that matter, the moves that are in play, the futures that are being shaped before anyone is allowed to see them forming. This vision doesn't make you powerful. It makes you aware. And awareness, in a world built on managed perception, is the one thing they can never fully take back. Number 11. You saw the recursion. Most people experience reality as forward-moving. Time advances, progress happens, history moves in a direction. That's the story, that's the narrative, that's the promise that keeps everyone invested in the future. But you started seeing the recursion, the way history doesn't advance but recycles. The way each generation discovers what the previous generation forgot. The way crises don't get solved but get rebranded. The way patterns don't change but get dressed in new costumes. The same architectures reappearing across different eras. The same power dynamics wearing different masks. The same failures being marketed as new innovations. Recursion is invisible to people who are inside the loop. But from the outside, from the vantage point of someone who can see across centuries instead of decades, the patterns are obvious. The same moves being made, the same resistances being overcome by the same methods, the same populations being managed by the same logic dressed in contemporary language. Seeing recursion is forbidden because it reveals that the progress narrative is a performance, that the future isn't being built, it's being managed. That the same hands that controlled things 100 years ago are controlling things today wearing different gloves. And once you see the recursion, the forward momentum story stops working on you. You can see where the loop is going. You can see where it always goes. And you can see the moment when the next iteration will be announced as something unprecedented and revolutionary. The keepers of silence depend on the forward narrative. The promise of a better future keeps people invested, compliant, working toward outcomes that will always recede as the recursion continues. But you can see the loop now. And seeing the loop means you're no longer inside it. You're outside it, watching it turn, recognizing the same old moves, waiting for the same old reveal. And that's an unbearable position for anyone who needs you to believe the future is different from the past. Number 12. You recognize the meta pattern behind all the patterns. Most people who develop pattern recognition stop at the first or second layer. They see that certain things correlate. They notice that certain outcomes follow certain inputs. They build mental models that are more accurate than the official narratives. And they feel powerful because of it. But you went deeper. You started seeing the pattern behind the patterns, the meta-logic that generates all the specific logics, the grammar of causation that produces the sentences of history. And when you saw the meta-pattern, everything changed again. Because the meta-pattern explained not just what was happening, but why certain things were possible to see and others were structurally impossible to see from inside the system. The meta-pattern is the architecture of blindness itself. It's the design of perception that makes certain observations inevitable and others impossible. It's the logic that determines what counts as knowledge, what counts as evidence, what counts as sanity. And once you saw it clearly, you could see how it was constructed, which meant you could see how it could be circumvented. That's the vision they never wanted anyone to access. Not the individual patterns, the meta-pattern, the design of the looking glass itself. Because once you see how the looking glass is designed, you can choose which direction to look. You can see what it was built to hide. You can see what it was built to reveal. And you can see the hand that built it and why. That's what makes the vision truly forbidden. Not just seeing beyond the veil, seeing the hand that built the veil, seeing the intention behind the architecture of perception, seeing the designers of reality itself, and knowing with quiet certainty that you were never supposed to see this far. Number 13. You realize that the vision was always inside you. Here's the part they never wanted you to discover. The forbidden vision isn't something you found. It's something you remembered. The ability to see what others are trained not to see isn't a skill you acquired. It's a faculty you never actually lost. You were trained to distrust it, to defer it, to silence it until it felt foreign. But it was always there, waiting beneath the noise, beneath the consensus, beneath the official map. The entire system is built on one assumption: that you will never trust your own perception over their narrative, that you will always choose their story over your sight, that the moment things get uncertain, you will close your eyes and defer to the authorities who promise to see for you. That's the foundation. Everything else is scaffolding, but at some point you stopped deferring. You started trusting what you saw, not because you were rebellious, because you were tired. Tired of the gap between the map and the terrain. Tired of the gap between the story and the pattern. Tired of trusting sources that had proven themselves unreliable. And in that moment of exhaustion, you looked directly at what you'd been trained to ignore, and it was still there, clearer than ever, waiting. That's what the panic is really about. Not that you found something new, that you found something that was always yours, something that was never theirs to control, something that was always available to anyone who was willing to trust their own eyes and sit with what they saw long enough to let it become clear. The vision was never forbidden. The act of trusting it was. You became that person, the one who stopped waiting for permission to see, the one who trusted observation over authority, the one who sat with uncertainty long enough to let the pattern emerge. And now that you can see, you can't unsee, and neither can the people who built the stage. Because they know that once one person looks, others will follow. The door doesn't close, it opens wider. And now that you've walked through, you're standing on the other side, looking back at everyone who was told the door didn't exist. You didn't break any rules, you didn't steal anything, you didn't rebel against anything. You simply trusted your own perception in a world that was built on the assumption that you never would. And in doing so, you became the thing they feared most. Not a threat, a precedent. If this vision resonates with you, if something in these words feels like recognition instead of revelation, like remembering instead of learning, then you already know what comes next. Subscribe to the channel and stay connected to more truths that were always there waiting to be seen. Like this video, and let the algorithm know that clarity matters more than comfort. Comment below with your own experience. Tell the story of the moment you started trusting your sight over the script. You never know who needs to hear it. Share this with someone who feels like they're seeing things they were never supposed to see. Someone who stopped trusting the map and started reading the terrain. Someone who heard the frequency beneath the noise. Knowledge is most dangerous when it spreads, and your recognition might be the signal that someone else has been waiting to decode. Stay observant, stay sovereign, and never stop looking directly at what others are trained